not also understand, though, is my driveway is off of West Street, and West Street is one of the last streets to get plowed. So actually, I'm probably in a worse situation than everybody else. But they always say the mayor's street gets plowed first. No, not really true. We have a reason, and we go according to that reason. Do not be secretive in your decision making. That's really important. And as we talk about the Open Meetings Act, you'll see even more of a necessity to be open and above board with all your decisions. And finally, you do not let favoritism or bias cloud your decision making. As a public official, you have an obligation now to be open to ideas. It is difficult to sit there on the dais and have somebody get in the audience in, venting whatever they're venting about. But every once in a while, somebody gets up in the audience and has a solution that, quite frankly, nobody's thought of before. And if that happens, be open enough to say, hey, look, we're going to be able to solve this problem because it's a suggestion you made out in the audience, and it really makes a difference. We have a few resources here, and a copy of this presentation is available directly from the city clerk. We've already sent it over to her. So these are a couple of other standard acts that get into ethical conduct in the state of Michigan. And one of my favorite quotes about ethics is, what you have a right to do does not equal what is right to do. And that comes from former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. Also, you need to think about ethics as it relates to social media. Social media is a great tool to communicate with the public. However, you have to make sure that you're representing your views, and if they're different than what the city council policy is, you got to make sure you're clear on that. Again, simply getting on social media and representing your own personal opinion as a city position is not ethical at all. And as I mentioned before, you're one member of the council, you're not the city council. I strongly recommend a social media code of conduct. Makes clear where the lines are and kind of helps out in that situation. It'll also help the public recognize that this is Chris Johnson's personal opinion, not the city's position.
Mr. Johnson, if I could interrupt, I think the city does have a social media policy. So that might just be something to track down. I remember Chief Kip provided that for me.
Okay.
But just making sure everybody has that.
Yes. And many communities, and I don't know whether you do or not, appoint council members as liaisons. So a liaison position is quite simply a conduit of information. You inform the board or commission of the council's policies and take the commission's questions and comments back to the city council. Your role isn't to advocate or second guess either the council or the particular board or commission that you are appointed as a liaison. It be a conduit of information, don't be an advocate. Now we're going to get into a couple of the sunshine laws that we have in the state of Michigan. The first one that I want to talk about is the Freedom of Information Act, better known as FOIA. If you don't know, we have to go all the way back to the Watergate scandal to see what was going on in 1974, where the president was having some real issues regarding being open and transparent. The response to Watergate was the Michigan legislature enacted two acts, the Freedom of Information Act in 1976, as well as the Open Meetings Act in 1976. They were both effective in 1977. The policy of the Freedom of Information Act is to make sure that all persons are entitled to complete information regarding the affairs of government and the acts of those who represent public officials. It's basically summarized in a court case where the people shall be informed so that they fully may participate in the democratic process. So what is the city required to provide? A public record. And a public record is defined in the Act as a writing which is prepared, owned, used, and in the possession or retained by the public body in the performance of its official function from the time it's created. Now, what is a writing? Well, they define that too. It's handwriting, typewriting, printing, etc. Well, back in 1976, when they adopted this act, they also threw in this thing at the very end of the definition, which was other means of recording or retaining meaningful content. And the reason for that is this woman here, that's Rosemary Woods, who is the President Nixon's secretary. And this was the position that she claimed she was in when she accidentally erased 18 minutes of a Watergate tape that had the crucial information regarding the wrongdoing that had occurred in that administration. So the significance of that change and that definition at the end is that the writing now includes not only paper, but emails, text, voicemail, and entry on a mobile data terminal. And those are the data terminals in your police cars, and they're not using the radio as much. They're just sending out information electronically. But all those items are considered to be writings under Michigan law now. The basic requirements of FOIA for the council are pretty limited. You need to appoint a FOIA coordinator, and that person is going to be the one that's actually responding to the Freedom of Information request. One practice point that I'd like to make is do not appoint a procrastinator as your FOIA coordinator. You have some really tight timelines, and sometimes getting on the FOIA response early makes all the difference in the world. And if you're constantly just shoving it to the end of the time period, you might run into some real problems. So appoint a FOIA coordinator and appoint a good one. You'll also have to provide reasonable access and reasonable protection for your public records. That's usually done again through the clerk's office. A FOIA request has limitations, and it's 5 days to respond with one single 10-day extension. And these are business days rather than actual days. It's really important to note that many communities run into real problems by missing a day, missing a couple days, or ignoring a FOIA request altogether. One thing that's important to recognize, though, under the Freedom of Information Act is that you do not have a duty to create or compile documents that don't exist. So let's say a group wants you to do a lot of research in a particular area and makes a request. It's more like an interrogatory in a lawsuit, and it's not a Freedom of Information Act request. So in that situation, you don't have to compile a document. Let's talk a little bit about some of the basic exemptions that will apply most often to your community. Bid documents. That one's kind of obvious. If the other company knew what you were going to bid on a particular issue, it would make their job a lot easier. Finding out what the test questions and answers are on a civil service exam is definitely a no-no. I'd love to go into any test knowing what all the questions and all the answers were going to be. Tentative bargaining agreements until they're actually adopted by both the city and the union are protected under the Freedom of Information Act. And there's a large Crime Victims' Rights Act that includes a number of different items that are protected under the Freedom of Information Act. One item that you may use several times during the course of your careers as a city councilor will be the attorney-client privilege. And that's where the city attorney is providing you with legal advice. And we're not talking about situations where the city manager just copies the city attorney and that makes it magically attorney-client privilege. We're talking about situations where the city has an issue, outlines that issue to the city attorney considers the legal aspects of it, puts together a opinion to the city, and then provides options for the city. That's the protected document I'm talking about. If the city attorney is communicating with someone other than the city, attorney-client privilege doesn't exist in that situation. Another particular exemption under the Freedom of Information Act is the Privacy Exemption. Though that information must be personal, reveal intimate or embarrassing details, or really confidential information. And its release must not help the public understand the operation of the government. It's really important to understand that just because somebody has the right to see somebody's personnel file, and for example, they do, unless it's a law enforcement officer, there's certain details in that personnel record that are still exempt. Social security numbers, banking information, and that sort of thing. Personnel records, as I mentioned, are not exempt except for law enforcement. And for example, that might include where a parent requests a copy of the teacher's personnel file. Information that regards a person's medical, counseling, or psychological records or social security numbers are always exempt. Do not turn that kind of material over under a Freedom of Information Act request. Police records are generally exempt when it would interfere with a law enforcement proceeding. So the police might find some very relevant details. If they were disclosed, the bad guy might find out that they're onto them. Operational plans of the police department. How are you going to respond to a bank robbery in the city? How are you going to respond to a riot? That sort of thing. The bad guys would like to know what your plan is in advance, so we don't provide that material under Freedom of Information Act request. And again, the police personnel records are generally exempt. And the reason, again, is obvious. Bad guys want to hurt law enforcement officers and their families. So all that material regarding police officers' children are exempt as well. When the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act were first adopted, laptops and desktop computers were science fiction. They just didn't exist at that point in time. And these little things that we hold in our hands, these little handheld computers, was science fiction. The closest thing we had to that was Dick Tracy's two-way wrist radio. And if you don't know who Dick Tracy is, I'll let you Google him and find out what I'm talking about. FOIA was passed in 1976, and there was no such thing as emails, text messaging, and social media. That just didn't exist. But email clearly falls within the definition of a writing. So it's a thing that is prepared, owned, and used in the possession of the governmental entity, and therefore subject to FOIA. Voicemail is also included. And here's the thing that's important for you to recognize. If you have a city-owned email address I recommend strongly that you do all of your city business through that email. Why? Because your local IT professionals can respond to a FOIA request through the city's email system. If you're using your own AOL account, or if you're using your own Yahoo account or Gmail account, the only place where a record might be found is on your own home personal computer or on your own personal smartphone. And it's important to recognize that there's a case out there called Howell Education Association versus Howell Board of Education. And this case is important for two reasons. It's known for a new concept, which is called purely personal communication. And that was where, a member of the public wanted every email that every teacher had sent out for any reason at all. And the Court of Appeals in that case said, look, some of this stuff just isn't relevant to government at all. It's personal communication, and it has nothing to do with the operation of government. And they cited things like, gee, spouse, would you stop at the store and pick up some bread and milk on the way home? Because I'm not going to have time to do that today. Or I'm stuck in a meeting, and would you please pick up the children from daycare? These sorts of things have nothing to do with the operation of the government, in this case, the school district. However, the court did say that the content of the message is more important than where the message is stored. So if it relates to city business, and it's the only place where that record may exist, and you're constantly using your own personal devices for storage of that information, a circuit court someday may say, city council member, please give us your home computer. We're going to clone your hard drive, and then we're going to go through it so that we can find whatever record is being requested under this Freedom of Information Act. It is so much easier for your IT professional to just go through the account that the city has already established for you and pull out all the relevant information than having to clone your own hard drive on either your home computer or your smartphone. We have a lot of information regarding the Freedom of Information Act on our website. There's a whole FOIA resource packet, and you can find that at mml.org. That's where our website is. We have a number of one-pager plus on FOIA. Again, you can go to resources and publications on our website, and just encourage you to do that. For those that really want to take a deep dive on FOIA, we have an ICL publication, that's the Institute for Continuing Legal Education. It's kind of a Bible for municipal attorneys, and there's a whole section on sunshine laws for local government in that resource as well. So the second item that I wanted to cover on sunshine laws is the Open Meetings Act, OMA as it's referred to. Again, we got there because of Watergate, and the actual language of the statute, I think, is very relevant in this situation. Public body means any state or local legislative authority or governing body. And here's the critical words: including a board, commission, committee, or subcommittee. And I think that's where a lot of folks get hung up and have ultimately a problem with a local circuit court judge. If you delegate a committee or a subcommittee and they're deliberating or narrowing down decisions, that is included within the definition of a public body and subject to the Open Meetings Act. And I don't think people realize that right in the context of what the definition of a public body is, that includes all these smaller groups. A number of communities, including even the regents of the University of Michigan, tried to break themselves up into little groups to avoid the Open Meetings Act. And the courts have always slapped them down. The policy, again, of the act is to make sure people know what's going on in government by conducting almost all of your business in an open meeting. And I will point out that the judicial view is very consistent since these cases have been filed in the late 70s. Here's some language from a case where they're talking about, we will not countenance use of strained legalisms to undermine the intent of the Open Meetings Act. This kind of language is really strong language and really shows how the courts will interpret cases under the Open Meetings Act. So basic requirements of the Open Meetings Act are that all meetings of a public body shall be open to the public. And all decisions of the public body need to be made at the Open Meetings Act. So if
Chris,
yes,
I believe Counselor Clark just has a quick question.
sure.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so when you have these subcommittees or committees and there's no public available, so should we be taking notes and bringing and submitting notes to the clerk of what was said and what happened in the meeting?
We're going to talk about the extent of minutes in a moment, but you do need to keep a record of the minutes of those meetings. They don't have to be a court transcript, for example, who said what and when they said it, sort of thing, but you do need to make a record of whatever decisions get made by that committee or subcommittee.
Okay, thank you.
So unless, again, there's a specific statutory exception, and we're going to go through those in a moment, all meetings have to be in public. And all deliberations of a public body need to be made in an open meeting unless, again, you have that specific statutory exception that allows you to meet in the closed session. So if you've got a public body, including a committee or subcommittee, that meets with a quorum present and is convened for the purpose of deliberating toward or reaching a decision on something by which a vote of the public body is required and is formulating public policy. So the Open Meetings Act will apply. And here, deliberation hasn't been defined in the act, but it has been defined by the courts as being any discussion leading to a decision. It can be something like carefully considering the various issues and options before the community. For example, let's narrow down the choices to the city council for 3 options. And you work from 20 options down to 3. That's deliberation. And the courts are pretty clear that that would be considered a meeting that needs to be held in public. As I mentioned before, we've actually got cases where people assume that if they weren't in the quorum of the entire city council, they could divide themselves up into subcommittees. The courts have held that that tactic is not acceptable. And over and over since the 1970s, have the courts ruled against public bodies that try that particular tactic. So what are your requirements for a meeting? The first is notice. You have to provide notice of your meetings. And within 10 days of the first meeting of either the fiscal year or the calendar year, your choice, you need to post your regular meeting schedule. And if you have a change in that, you need to update that right away. You also have a website, so you need to post those notices on your website as well. Special meetings and rescheduled regular meetings require at least 18 hours notice. And don't play games with that. I've actually been involved with cases where, the notice went up at such a late time, and then the building was closed and nobody got to see the notice before the meeting actually happened, and had a circuit court judge, invalidate the action that was taken by that township board in that particular case. So don't play games with that. Make sure you have at least 18 hours. And you do need to keep minutes of all your meetings, the date, time, place, members present, members absent. Any decisions that are made have to be in those minutes. And then the purpose of any closed session has to be listed in the minutes where the roll call vote is taken. One of the important concepts, though, is remember, these are a set of minutes. These are not court transcripts. Quite frankly, when I started as mayor, the council had a whole, had an idea basically that everything that everybody said had to be in the minutes. And literally, the council used to debate, for half an hour on adopting the minutes because I didn't say that. What I said was this, and I said this, not that. And this would go on for 20 minutes just to adopt the minutes. I made sure that they rectified that situation and said, the city council discussed the budget as opposed to, Chris Johnson said this and Joe Doak said that and Mary Smith said this. That's not a set of minutes. That's a court transcript, and you don't need to be that detailed. But these are the items that I've listed on the screen that have to be in the minutes. Public comment is very important in the Open Meetings Act, and that is that citizens have the right to address a meeting. They also have the right to tape or video record it. It's right in the act. You don't have any choices about that. The city can and may establish reasonable rules for public comment. Each person gets X amount of time is very acceptable. And another issue that's out there is that a person may only be removed from a meeting for a breach of the peace that is committed at that meeting. So let's say, for example, that Chris Johnson comes to a meeting as a real idiot and disrupts the meeting to the point where the mayor has to call on the police to escort me out the door. Well, just because I was an idiot at that first meeting doesn't mean I'm going to be an idiot at the second meeting. So I get to be allowed into the second meeting or the next meeting or the next meeting. If I commit a breach of the peace at that meeting, I can be escorted out the door again. But you can't get a personal protective order forcing somebody not to come to a public meeting. It's just not considered doable under the Open Meetings Act. You may limit the comments to certain sections of the agenda, and that's important too. You can do it at the beginning of a meeting, you can do it during the meeting, you can do it at the end of a meeting. I would suggest, just as a political strategy, that if you wait for after the meeting is basically over and all of the decisions have already been made, you will have a public that is fuming by the time that the public comment section has happened because you haven't listened to them before you take your vote on a particular issue. You may restrict the amount of time that the individual may speak, again, at certain sections of the meeting, but you cannot limit the total amount of time that the public comment section occurs at. And why is this important? Sometimes you get in those situations where, the fourth or fifth person in the audience gets up and is saying the exact same thing as the four persons in front of them. And while you can't eliminate them from talking, I found that there's a very good technique that I used to use that almost always worked. And that is to accurately listen and summarize the speaker's view. And you'll say something to the effect of, okay, Mr. Smith, what you're saying is A, B, and C. And usually Mr. Smith will say, yeah, that's exactly what I said. And then what you can do is kind of turn to the audience and say, how many in the audience agree with Mr. Smith? Raise your hand. it is amazing. The whole room will raise their hand if they're all there for the same reason. But to be fair, you should also ask the same question in reverse. How many disagree with Mr. Smith's position? And you might get a hand or two that, go up. And what happens there is the public is actually participating in the meeting. They are letting you know what they feel about a particular issue. And they didn't have to all stand in line and have to have 35 people say the exact same thing to you. Keep that in mind as that situation happens. It's a very good technique that I think can assist you in running a better meeting. Now let's get a little bit into the closed sessions, calling the closed session and actually closing it. First, you always have to start out in an open meeting. Then there can be a motion and a second to adopt a motion to go into closed session. And you need one of the statutory reasons to go into the closed session. A majority vote is needed for going into closed session over the disciplining or personnel evaluation of an official or an employee, or for collective bargaining agreement. Everything else requires a 2/3 roll call vote of the council to go into the closed session. The roll call vote and the purpose for calling that closed session should be entered into the minutes of the open meeting. That's really important. There's actually a case on point where the local public body did not go and enter it into the minutes. And the court, again, invalidated some of the actions that were taken when they came out of closed session because they didn't list the reason for going into closed session. And if you're going into closed session for more than one reason, list all the reasons that you're going into closed session for. You might be going into it for a collective bargaining agreement, as well as, for example, the purchase of some property. If you're going in for two different reasons, list both of the reasons in your minutes. So let's go over the actual statutory reasons for going into a closed session. And I'm going to take these in order of the statute, not because they're in any particular order of importance, just easier to follow the statute this way. So if a person is going to be dismissed, suspended, or disciplined, or the council is going to hear complaints about it, and that person requests a closed session, the council can go into closed session to hear those complaints or the evaluation of that particular officer or employee. That requires, again, a majority vote of council. Closed sessions are also allowed for strategy and negotiation sessions for collective bargaining agreement, if requested by either party, the union or the council. And generally, the council will want to do this as well, because you don't want to turn over your strategy while you're still in negotiations. That, by the way, can occur before the negotiations actually start. You can build some consensus within the council prior to going into the collective bargaining negotiation. I would suggest, though, that you not go 2 years in advance of that. I think there's going to be some reluctance on the part of a court to actually believe that you're doing strategy for collective bargaining agreement when it's that far away. The next reason for going into closed session is to consider the purchase or lease of real property. And again, this is probably a very understandable reason. If the person that owns the property at Main Street and Elm Street knows that your government is looking at purchasing the property, the price just doubled or tripled or maybe even went up 5-fold, because people, rightly or wrongly, make the assumption that government has the resources to pay whatever the owner would like to have for that property. So that sort of information is done in closed session. And I want to point out that that is for the purchase of real property or leasing of real property. It's not for the sale of real property. And sometimes people get that mixed up. The fourth reason for going into closed session is to consult with an attorney regarding specific settlement strategy, regarding specific pending litigation, and only if it'll have a detrimental financial effect on the position of the city in litigation or settlement. So that really means if there's a case of Smith versus the city of Albion, where, for example, they're alleging that excessive force was used by a police officer, you can go into closed session to review that. You can't go into closed session because somebody in the back of the audience says, I'm going to sue you. That's not an active pending litigation that's specific. I'm going to sue you is just a threat. It's not a specific case that they're dealing with. The next situation where you can go into closed session is to review and consider the contents of an application for employment if the candidate requests that the application remain confidential. And here the reason is obvious again. If a particular administrator in a different community was interested in coming to your community and doesn't want their current employer to know about it, at least until the interview situation, that material remains confidential. So it's also important to realize that once a decision has been made by the council to interview these three particular candidates for the position, then the interviews have to be conducted at an open meeting. Finally, there's a section of the Open Meetings Act that says to consider material that's exempt from discussion or disclosure by state or federal statute. For example, if it's exempt under FOIA. An example might be a written opinion by the municipal attorney. Again, the municipal city's attorney has written an opinion to you and is discussing your legal options. You can go into closed session to review that opinion with the attorney. Remember, though, to keep that discussion within the context of the attorney's opinion and the various factual basis for going into closed session. You don't include budget discussions or things of that nature. You might be reviewing an appraisal for particular property. Again, until you're actually entering into a lease or purchase of property, those discussions and those appraisals might be confidential until you actually enter into that contract. And for example, if you want to review the security plans for, defending the water plant, that can be discussed in a closed session because security plans are items that can be exempt. The Open Meetings Act requires a separate set of minutes. And again, there's kinds of things that are required in the other minutes: who's present, who is not, time of the meeting, where the meeting took place. Finally, you want to discuss, or you want to say that you were discussing the collective bargaining agreement. You didn't come to any decisions on that, because when you finally decide on something, that has to take place in the open meeting. The clerk or designated secretary of the public body takes those minutes. And finally, this is very important, the minutes may only be disclosed if required by a court order. So, for example, even if a person had requested a closed meeting and then later on withdraws that request for a closed meeting, those minutes that were taken in the closed meeting stay confidential until a court orders them to be done. The city council may meet in closed session to discuss closed session minutes. So that is something that can be a reason for a closed session. And minutes of a closed session are destroyed 1 year and 1 day after the minutes were approved at a regular meeting, and might include, if you keep them that way, the audio tape of the meeting. Remember, what happens in closed session stays in closed session. And I can't overemphasize that. There's a reason under the Open Meetings Act to keep certain kinds of discussions confidential. It might invade somebody's privacy. It might lead to a significantly higher cost for the city to purchase some piece of property. And an Attorney General's opinion in 2000 actually set out that a person who discloses confidential minutes is subject to both criminal and civil penalties under the Open Meetings Act. And many municipal attorneys also argue that this applies to any information that is discussed in a closed session.
Chris, it looks like Councilmember Lawler has a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
So my question is about the closed sessions. You know, we get a packet for our closed sessions, and since we are doing things virtually, how does the MML recommend that we, because I know we have to have these documents, but is it okay for the document to be sent with our regular packet, or how is the MML doing that now, if I'm explaining it right?
Let me take a
keep it
crack at it.
confidential.
Generally, the way I've seen it done most often is that it'll be in a separately marked packet, stamped on the outside confidential. So it can go with the regular packet, but it's separated from the regular meeting materials.
So it's okay for it to come out to our homes. Do you recommend that we disregard it or we turn it back in? Because I know normally when we have our closed sessions, we have to give our closed session packet back to our clerk. So that's why I was asking, you know, has anything changed with that, or it's okay? It's all right.
I would recommend that those materials be destroyed as soon as the meeting's over. The clerk has access to the documents should a court need to review them. Just keeping them laying around the house means that somebody else someday, sometime can pick them up and walk away with them. So I would destroy them, at least while we're in these virtual times. When we have a chance to get back to live in-person meetings, again, I recommend that people just hand the materials back to the clerk, you know, for destruction right there.
You recommend that we destroy these documents ourselves?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, Councilmember Lawler. I think it's just to keep in mind that information is for your eyes only. So when you get that separate closed session packet, that is information for you to review. And after we have our closed session meeting, yes, you should destroy that information right away until we return back to our in-person meeting settings.
Okay, thank you.
And violating confidentiality in a closed session could result in, again, depending on your ethics ordinances or rules of conduct, definitely violates Robert's Rules of Order if you've adopted those, and particularly your oath of office. So again, there's a reason for the closed session. That information is confidential. Please keep it confidential. This little section of the presentation is, OMG, did I just violate the OMA? Or really, it's the Open Meetings Act versus the iPhone. As you recall, 1976, we had different tools available to us. We didn't have all the technology that we have today. All these really great devices that make business work so much smoother. This is kind of, this particular photo, I liken the state legislature too. They see some terrible things happening, but nobody's taking any corrective action with dealing with this new technology now. And the technology trap is here for the Open Meetings Act, same as it is for Freedom of Information Act. This stuff was science fiction in 1976. And when it actually went into effect in 1967 or 77, I was on a school board, and I can tell you it made radical and different changes in the way things happened for our community. Deliberation can actually be done electronically, and both emails and texting can be a violation in the Open Meetings Act. Let me give you a quick example. A city council member comes up with a great idea. The council member shares this idea with the entire city council by way of an email. You know, dear city council members, this is a great idea. What do you think? Then other members of the city council start hitting reply all through the email feature of the system. Do you see the problem? Garrett? Councilmember Brown has a hand raised? Maybe not. So the real problem there is the real problem there is that you haven't followed the procedures of the Open Meetings Act. And a social media situation also gets you in the same sort of trouble very quickly. Again, let's use an example. City Council member 1 of a 5-person council takes to her social or Facebook page to champion a new idea regarding the city. Council member 2 does not like the great idea and responds to the post on Facebook. Later on, a couple days later, Council member 3 agrees with board member 1 and sends a reply into that social media page. You now have 3 council members of the 5-member council deliberating about public policy on social media. Now, while it might be open to people that have access to that Facebook account, it doesn't follow any of the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Number 1, notice. There's no notice that's given to the public in that situation. 2, there's no minutes taken. And 3, there's no ability for the public to comment, especially when everybody's hitting reply all to an email. Why is this important? Well, think about it. We're being trained in business right now to hit reply all so that everybody knows what everybody else is thinking. You know, contribute your idea, make sure that everybody knows what your position is. You have these built-in business rules that we all come to accept. The problem is the Open Meetings Act doesn't permit that kind of deliberation. So what happens if you do violate the Open Meetings Act? Well, the first thing is you can have your action invalidated. So a county prosecutor or any person, by the way, which also includes the media, can bring a civil action in a circuit court to invalidate your action. So this was something that you've worked very hard on, but if you did it all by way of electronically debating it by way of email, it's going to be invalidated. And I've actually seen a case our office had when I was in private practice where recreation board's decision was totally invalidated because they decided what they were going to do by way of email before the meeting actually took place. And per the Attorney General's office, and I've given you the legal citation here, persons that are disseminating closed session minutes are subject potentially to criminal and civil penalties. The Open Meetings Act also provides for criminal misdemeanor penalties against any public official who intentionally violates the act. Could be 90 days and $1,000 for the first offense, and up to a year and $2,000 for second or subsequent violations of the Open Meetings Act. And here's another thing that I think is very important for you to understand and recognize. Our current Attorney General was at a press conference where this subject came up in a direct question to her. And she stated publicly that if her office becomes aware of a violation, intentional violation of the Open Meetings Act, her office was prepared to prosecute criminally those individuals. Since 1976, I know of no attorney general that's made a public pledge like that, where they basically are saying, we think we will prosecute you and we will root you out for violating the Open Meetings Act. That's kind of a new development. Now we have something where a lot of what I've talked about kind of is all interacting all at the same time. And that was the fact that we now are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Whitmer issued stay-at-home orders, which were followed up by a number of executive orders extending it and allowing for meetings virtually. The Michigan Supreme Court issued two very important decisions with respect to the governor's powers. And there were basically two acts that the governor was acting under. First was the Emergency Powers of the Governors Act, which was adopted in 1946, and the Emergency Management Act, which had been adopted in 1976. And what the Michigan Supreme Court did was rule that the 1976 Emergency Management Act required that the governor actually get the consent of the legislature to extend an emergency beyond 28 days. The Supreme Court also ruled that that 1946 Emergency Powers of the Governor Act was unconstitutional because it delegated too much legislative authority to the governor. I mentioned before that local government is a creature and subject to the interpretation of the courts. And this is a prime example of what happened. So as a result of that particular act, the legislature did pass and sign Public Act 228 of 2020 and allowed virtual meetings to take place by local elected bodies, something that we're doing right now here today. And virtual meetings by an amendment to that act are allowed all the way until March of this year. And at that time, your city attorney will keep you informed as to whether or not you'll be able to allow virtual meetings and under what circumstances those may happen. Public service is really important, but one of the things I think that's really important about it is my first rule of public service, and that is it isn't fun if you're sitting in jail. And violating the Open Meetings Act could be one of those things that could land you there. And all the good reasons that you get involved with for running for public office are important. Don't get hung up on a technicality and end up with a circuit court judge ordering you to jail for violating something that's very technical in nature. Listen to your city attorney. Pay attention to the advice that they're giving on this critical question. And if you have questions or comments, I'm free to answer those.
Mr.
Go
Johnson,
ahead, Counselor. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you. I really appreciate your thorough attention and all of the court cases and different references. So I just wanted to thank you.
Welcome.
So I do have a question.
Sure.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understood what you said as far as when we're in the meetings, we now have the public comments. Generally, when someone has a question, we answer it at the end of the meeting. But from what I heard you say, out of courtesy, it's better to answer the meeting, the question when it's being posed, and then reflect to the audience to see, how many others feel like that. And it kind of, I guess, would say soften the tone if it's something that they're really being adamant about.
Well, there's a couple of different things that can happen during public comment. One is a question can come from the audience, and oftentimes they're very simple questions. When does this program start? And you know that it starts on May the 1st. A simple, the program starts on May the 1st, and those issues get resolved immediately and they're done. If somebody's questioning, actually questions aren't public comments, okay? Technically, they're not at all. When somebody poses a question, you may or may not want to answer it. You may not have the answer to the question. Hey, what's the dollar amount in, this line item of a budget? And that could be something that only the finance director has after they look it up in the register or something. We'll try and get back to you later on that question, or we'll, send an email, leave your email address, and we'll email you the answer later on. Handle it as politely as possible. But remember, public comment is public comment. They can get up and tell you, hey, I think you're going down the right path with this particular issue. I think you're going down the wrong path in this particular issue. There can be a wide variety of public comment, but it's comment. It's not question and answer time. You don't need to get into those debates with the public. And sometimes I had city council members that were wanting to debate the audience, and I'd have to stop the council because that's not a forum for doing the city's business. A city council meeting is structured for a reason, so you complete the business of the city rather than getting bogged down with a debate during the meeting. It's one thing to debate among yourselves. It's another thing to and I don't even mean debate, it's discuss items of concern to you as council members. But mixing it up with the public is probably a bad idea when it comes to, the public comment section of a meeting.
Okay.
Okay. We've been at this for a little while, and I know Coco's ready to go, but do we want to take a quick 5-minute break, grab something to drink, and then be back at, I think I've got 10:31. Would that be acceptable?
Sure, let's do that. Let's take a 5-minute and come back at 10:31.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Coco, I just wanted to clarify before, we begin on your portion. Are you set up to share your screen and do the slides, or would you like my help?
I would like you to do it. Thank you, Ms. Whitfield.
Okay.
And Mayor, shall I get started?
Yeah, I think we do have, well, almost everybody back. I'm not sure if Councilwoman Lanu and Clark are still away from the desk. Oh,
There we go.
got
Well,
Council.
thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting Chris and I to come today. This is just wonderful. And as you say, we're taking part of people's weekend and hope to make it worthwhile. Your rules of procedure, which I had an opportunity to read, are very thorough. And it's interesting because they start right in Rule 1 with the point that is important to know, and that is what the funnel of laws is, if you will. And Chris certainly alluded to some of them, but the one that is first on our list, of course, is the US Constitution. We can't do anything in local government that's in conflict with the US Constitution. And then any federal laws which may apply, state laws, and Chris certainly reviewed two that are very important to local government. And then your own city charter, then your rules of procedure, and then Robert's rules. So it's important to know where Robert's rules fits in it. You can have rules and practices that are in conflict with Robert's and still use Robert's for the rest of the things. And it's interesting because your rules of procedure in Rule 1 says that these rules will apply, and if they are in conflict with anything else, if they are in conflict with Robert's, that's perfectly all right. Your rules supersede Robert's. If any of you, I'm sure all of you are parts of nonprofit organizations and know that the bylaws typically have as the last bylaw amendment in them, article in it. These rules apply. When these rules are applied, anything that's in Robert's, these rules are more important. These rules are bigger, if you will. So I think that that's always important. This is Robert's Rules of Order. This is the new book. This is the 12th edition, just came out in August. It will mean very little to any of you. It makes parliamentarians do little happy dances, but the rest of the world does not really care. How do I know that? In the 1970 edition, more than 50 years ago, the book said, please don't say old business. Old business is what you already did. What you should be using is unfinished business. How often do you think, that's more than 50 years ago, they said, please don't call it old business. How often do you think I see the words old business on an agenda when I go to assist an organization? All the time. So clearly, even though it was more than 50 years ago, hasn't made any difference. The other thing that's in the book that is very common is it said, it's not wrong to use respectfully submitted, but it is considered outdated. And yet I do see that all the time too. So don't be concerned. In addition, it happens about every 10 years that they do a new Roberts. And I would say to you, if you need a Roberts rules, buy the new one because they've made a much bigger index. So it's easier to find things. If you don't need one, there's not one change in this book that affects local government. And in fact, I notice in your rules of order, you have actually included the Roberts Rules motions sheet. And this, as nothing has changed. So this one, everything that's on here is still 100% accurate. Yes, please. Oh, I'm so glad you raised your hand, council member, because I love questions.
I was curious, you said respectfully submitted was outdated. Is there suggested new language?
No language.
Okay.
Just at the bottom of the minutes, it would say the name of the secretary and the date the minutes are approved.
I got it. Okay. Thank you.
That's very good to ask a question about minutes because as Chris said, people put way too much in minutes. his is not the only community where I have seen people spend a lot of time arguing about what was in the minutes. There is a community where they say very nasty things about one another, and the clerk actually includes it in the minutes. So then they argue about that at the next meeting. I was invited to do a comparison of what the Open Meetings Act requires and what Robert's Rules requires when it comes to minutes, a side-by-side comparison. It's exactly the same. Robert says what was done, not what was said. The Open Meetings Act has no request for what was said, only what was done. And in fact, there was only one difference I could find between the rules for minutes in Roberts and the rules for minutes in the Open Meetings Act. And that is that minutes for your nonprofit and your church organization, school, temple, what have you, those can be amended if you find something later that was wrong. Public minutes can never be amended. So I asked a long-time serving city clerk, Connie Dufort of Bay City, what do you do then if you find an error that was in old minutes? And she said, you can't correct them, but you can write in the margin. She said, we go back and we write in the margin of those minutes what the correction was. So minutes are what was done, not what was said. And so as we look at that funnel of laws, one of the most common things to think about is Robert says the name of the maker is in the motion, but not the seconder. Like Chris, I have been around in this municipal game for a very, very long time, including my service as a council member and as a mayor and as parliamentarian for the MML for over 25 years. There is not a city, village, or town in this state that doesn't have both the name of the maker of the motion and the seconder in the minutes, because that is how we do it in local government. And so that's a conflict with Roberts. Does that mean you don't use the rest of the book? No, it just means you have your own practice in that. I thought the question from council member, I think it was Clark, who asked about the subcommittees. And that's because I noticed that in your rules, it says when there is an appointed group of 3 or less to consider something, you will allow that. I think that that could be construed as meaning you don't count that as a public meeting, the way you have it written. But actually, when 3 people are appointed, they are a subcommittee. And as was pointed out, that subcommittee is listed in the Open Meetings Act as something that needs notice. And again, those minutes, focusing on minutes for a moment, are no more than who was there, when you started, when you finished, and what the topic was. That's all that's required. If you also have been appointed to make a recommendation, the recommendations that you're going to report out might be in the minutes, but that's it. So they're very, very short, very easy.
Okay.
Yes.
So when we're in this, because I've been in a couple of subcommittees and we've discussed things. So I want to be clear. So we discussed what we had the committee selected for, what are the areas that we're considering, and then bring them back. No decisions are being made there. They are to be brought back to council.
That is correct now, but
Okay.
I want to be cautious about the word no decisions, because as in the example that Chris gave you, you've narrowed down 20 possibilities to 3.
Yeah.
So those were deliberations, those were decisions in that way. But
Right.
now the decision about action, you are right, that goes to council.
Okay.
That goes directly to council.
Okay.
But that a focus on deliberating toward a decision is really the issue. As soon as some people say, well, a community tried to tell me that they don't publicize their study sessions because they don't make decisions at the study sessions. And my answer was, as soon as you start talking about something, you are deliberating, you are making decisions. And So I asked this person, I said, well, after a decision is made to present something to council at a council meeting, do you then debate it again? He said, oh no, we just always just vote on it, kind of a rubber stamp. I said, well, then you realize that the deliberations, the decisions were all made in the study session. So that's why that should be open to the public. So it's so easy to just do what the Open Meetings Act says. It's most of the time when we have really important things, I always laughed about budget hearings. The city has a long range, a whole day to approve the new budget, discuss everything. Public doesn't come. We've offered lunch, we've offered all kinds of food, incentives. They don't come. And then they complain later about the budget. So, and that's just the nature of the public. So having gotten that idea of where Robert sits in the whole run of things, somebody picks up the book and waves it and says, well, Robert says, one of the things that we'll talk about is motions. And a community had a situation where a motion was made, seconded, debated, voted on, and adopted by a 4-3 vote. And after about 20 minutes, the member who had seconded the motion said, I'm going to withdraw my second on that motion. So therefore, the motion doesn't count because it says in Roberts that you need a second for a motion. And they so that can't be right. That can't be right. We voted on it. But he insisted, and he held up the book and he read the section that says a motion needs a second. So they said, all right, well, if he withdrew his second, I guess there's no, that must be that the motion didn't pass, that the motion is gone. So of course it kept the city clerk awake all night. City clerks do stay awake all night when things like this happen. And she called me very first thing in the morning. And I said, of course, that was wrong. Because for one thing, as soon as the first person speaks about a motion, it is effectively seconded. If you forget to ask for a second, what a second is no more than another person saying, hey, I'm interested in that too. So once somebody speaks to it, effectively, it has been seconded. But the point was they voted 4-3 to adopt it. And that was not undone because he didn't want to have a second. But that was a situation where the person read that one line from the book and the others believed them. I asked one of the authors that I have had a chance to teach with, why are your sentences so long? I asked Thomas Balch. The sentences in Roberts are so long. He said, that's because I don't want you to be able to quote just a piece of it. I want to get the whole idea out the whole time. This is a nationally known parliamentarian who, of course, is an attorney, Chris, and to the assistant city manager. He said, so if I leave this, give you short sentences, then you could only take parts of it. But if I give you a whole long sentence, you have to read the whole thing. Let's go on to the screen share, if we could now, Ms. Whitfield. Here we go. The first slide is what's in your city charter. And I think this is a good suggestion that Chris made, which is read your charter. It really has, especially the two sections he mentioned on your role in particular, but the whole thing. And also read your rules of procedure. They're quite detailed and very useful. And first question, how frequently must the regular meetings be held? Now, I can't see you because of the screen share, so I'm just going to say somebody just call out the answer.
Bi-weekly.
Okay. And I saw that in the charter. Does the charter describe how to fill a vacancy on council? Have you had to fill a vacancy on council?
Yes.
Yes.
And how was it done?
The council decided,
I believe there were interviews
Uh-huh.
of qualified candidates, and the council decided upon the best candidate by a vote.
Excellent. May the council vote by mail or telephone?
No. Or telephone.
No,
No.
the answer was correct when you said no. For all the reasons that Chris gave you about the Open Meetings Act, neither a mail vote nor a telephone vote is available for the public. Now, as we discussed in our few comments in the early part, many communities are now virtually having to vote effectively by telephone because they don't have the ability to show the people's faces. They don't have that technology. So some communities are having to now vote by telephone. And of course, they're doing that only by roll call. This is a good opportunity for many communities that don't ordinarily use roll call have switched to it in the virtual world. Anybody have a question about that? Okay. Is there any limitation on what can be expended by the administration on a project without prior approval?
Over $5,000 requires approval.
Okay, good.
yes.
With whom does the final authority rest on any decision? I always like this question because it's really in Chris's PowerPoint, the answer really is public opinion. Because it's what the public gets to do at the next election that makes the difference on what comes out. Now, how many votes are required for adoption of a motion by majority vote?
4.
4. And the reason I have that question is because that's a charter issue in many, many cities in particular. If they have the portion in the charter that says that the number needed for quorum is the minimum number for something to be adopted. Some cities have that and some cities do not. So in my city, we do. So it means that if there are only 4 council members present and there's a request being made from the city, say by a developer, you might hear the mayor say, there are only 4 council members present, and that's the minimum number for something to be adopted. Do you wish to come back and do a presentation in front of the full council? Because in my city, a 3-to-1 vote doesn't pass. Does a 3-to-1 vote pass in Albion?
No.
See, that's a good thing to know. It as I say, that varies from city to city, so you want to check on that. How recently was the charter revised? Your charter is relatively new, isn't it?
Yes. I think it was revised during not the last mayor, but the previous mayor.
Correct.
It's frequently changes in state law, changes in,
1960s was the last time ours was revised.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it was a major revision, as I recall correctly, wasn't it?
Yes. Sorry, stuck on mute. Yes.
Why parliamentary procedure? I get this question all the time. Why should we use Roberts? Why do we bother with that? It's such a big book. There's so many rules. Well, the answer is most of the time you're using only the basic portion of Roberts, which is a few motions. And the advantage of it, it allows individuals to express opinions. It focus is discussion. When you have a motion on the floor, that's the only thing that you should be talking about. It saves time, results in decision-making, and provides a record in the minutes. The basic objectives of parliamentary law. Now, this one slide really tells the story. The next slide, please. Because this is what the whole book, if you took the whole book and squeezed it and just got the basic ideas, this is it. Accomplish the objectives for which the group is organized, expedite business, ensure justice and equality to all, and maintain order. That's really what it comes down to. And in fact, if you have any thoughts about parliamentary procedure, when people say to me, well, why should we use Robert's rules? And I say to them, well, it is just the basic material. What do you do in your meetings? Oh, well, we make motions and vote. Well, that's really all Roberts is. But it does have, the next slide shows us the basic principles. The organization is paramount. All members have equal rights, and an established minimum number of members must be present in order to transact business. And of course, that's what we were just talking about. That is the quorum. Anybody have any questions?
Ms. Kogo, I was curious. I haven't seen you mention the word fairness, but that was my understanding of a core principle of Robert's Rules of Order.
Yes, you are correct. And that's one of the reasons why, and in your rules reflect this, the opportunity for people to have an opportunity to speak. One of the things that General Henry M. Robert was an engineer, and he was a military man. And so when I do quite a bit of teaching of parliamentary procedure for people who want to take the national levels of examinations to be certified by the National Association of Parliamentarians. And they always start out going, oh, I don't think I'll ever get this. This is so difficult. And not too long, they say, you know what? This really makes sense. This really fits into order. And it's because he was a military man and an engineer. Roberts does make a lot of sense. And it falls into a pattern that becomes quite quickly apparent to people. So
Thank you. Yeah.
So you are correct. It is all about fairness. He really would have hated the pandemic and the fact that we're meeting virtually. Oh, he probably is turning over in his grave at the mere thought of what this is like. But he would have loved the New England town meetings. He really likes it, which is why, and I just had this question this week from a nonprofit that wanted to vote by proxy at their next meeting. And we looked at their bylaws, and their bylaws do not allow for voting by mail or by proxy. And Roberts is very clear, you can't do either of those unless it's in your bylaws. He felt so strongly about people getting together and debating and discussing, which is why a good portion of the book is about how to have debate and how to take turns. So the fairness issue is definitely there. Some more basic principles are only one main proposal may be before the assembly at a time, and only one member may have the floor at a time. And remember, I said main proposal, because very often we have a main motion on the floor and we have other motions that happen like amendments. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Silence gives consent. That is really an important step. The thought that really, if you might say it this way, when election day comes and your neighbor says to you, well, I'll show them, I'm not going to vote. You should smile to yourself and say, thank you for making my vote count more, because that's what really happens. Because when we don't exercise our right to vote and we remain silent or abstain, we are basically saying, you go, whatever you choose is okay with me. I just watched a council meeting where 2 people abstained on a motion, and I think that's not what they meant. I think they meant to oppose the motion, but they thought that by taking no action, that by abstaining, they were somehow expressing themselves. And I think that they're going to be disappointed when they realize that actually they simply remained silent and let the rest of the group make the decision. A proposal or issue is the item under discussion, never the person who introduced it. Next, please. Suggested rules of debate for council. The maker of the motion is entitled to speak first, and that is indeed in your rules, and that's Robert's rules. A member may not speak against his own motion, but may vote against it. How might that happen? Somebody want to puzzle that one out?
I mean, I would assume, you can't argue against what you're saying, but if through the discussion that happens, you decide, oh, I was wrong, and you learned something and you don't want to vote in support of it, then you could change your mind.
That's exactly right. And of course, along the way, you might even say, I request permission to withdraw my motion. But that is a permission of not the chair, but you're asking the permission of the whole assembly. I was acting as parliamentarian for a very large convention. It was about 3,000 people, and someone came to the microphone and made a motion. It was seconded, the chair stated it, and the member chose not to speak to it, but debate began, and about maybe 5 minutes later, the member came back to the microphone and said, that wasn't what I meant. I want to withdraw my motion. So of course the chair had stated it, so the motion belonged to everybody. So the chair said to the assembly, the member would ask permission to withdraw the motion. Shall she have permission? And there was this big no vote. And they voted, so the chair actually took a vote. All those in favor of allowing her to withdraw a motion say aye, those opposed say no. The noes have it and the motion is not withdrawn. So the member told me later she voted against it, but everybody else voted for it. So that can sometimes happen. And of course, the other thing is your motion may have been made and somebody has amended it, and now it isn't what you meant. So you had moved to purchase benches, and it was seconded and stated by the chair, and then somebody moved to insert the word pews in front of benches, and that motion was adopted, and now the motion is to buy pew fences, and you are not interested in that. All remarks must be limited to the merits of the subject under discussion. And I always like that one, because in local government, there's something we do better than any other kind of organization, and that's get off the topic. We start talking about those benches, and then we're going to say, well, they're going to be in the park. Are we going to buy salt this year for when it snows? Because the salt could really hurt the benches. Did we use up all the money from salt that we had for salt last year? That reminds me, I think that there's paving that needs to be done on Elm. We do that all the time. And I will show you on your chart where you have a way to get around that when that happens. But we get off the topic better than any kind of organization. All remarks must be addressed to and through the chair. If you are a chairman of a committee, president of an organization, in any way, if you have to preside over a meeting, any meeting, there are 2 things you can do that will make your meeting go much smoother and will make you look like a really great chair. The first one is to always state the motion after it's made and seconded. And you'll know if that's not happening if you're in a meeting where somebody says, what are we voting on anyway? That means that the chair did not state the motion. And this is the second rule. Have all remarks addressed to and through you as the chair. Say to people, please raise your hand if you would like to speak, and don't speak out unless I call on you. Personal comments about other individuals should be avoided, of course. Members are seldom referred to by name, rather by title. And that is, again, a personal decision made by the council. And I find that courtesy and civility improve when people call on each other by title. It's a council member Fred, council member Smith, or council member Jones. No member may comment adversely on any prior act of the council. And that's just to leave things that are done, not bring them over. Next, please. Oh, you got it. Suggested rules during public debate. No person should speak a second time. This is public debate, as long as another is requesting to speak for a first time on the issue. Remarks should be limited to 2 minutes. I'm a big fan of 2 minutes, but the most common in Michigan is actually 3 minutes for public debate. The speaker may be asked but not required to state name and any other requested identifying information. And I see in your rules, you do say name and address. Next, please. Remarks must be confined to the pending question. And I noticed that you have not uncommon where the meeting is open to the public in the beginning for items on the agenda, and then meeting open to items not on the agenda at the end. And that is a practice that is, I think, a good one, especially if you have a long-winded public that wants to talk about a lot of things. That way you can get right to the business of the city and get it taken care of, and then at the end have the opportunity for other comment. Does this work well?
I would say yes.
Yes.
And I find that communities who have that are quite pleased with it. One of the things that has evolved a lot during the time that I have been observing municipal government in Michigan is many more communities are now having comment on each individual item as it goes through, so that they have the meeting is not open to the public in the beginning, but the public is allowed to speak on every issue as it comes up. One of the advantages to that is that the public can hear the report. So, for example, the next item on the agenda is the paving of Elm Street. May we please have a report from the DPW director? The DPW director gives the report. Now the public has the same information out there. All the people who are attending have the same information, and often questions are answered in the progress of through that report that the public is then informed about and does not come to the microphone. Communities who have this as an established practice after a while really like it. Communities that don't have it are appalled by the idea that it might make the meeting last way too long. So it's something to take into account. The point simply is that every meeting must have the words public comment someplace on the agenda. During debate, the chair may make an effort to alternate between supporting and opposing arguments. And you heard Chris give another alternative on how to do that in terms of summarizing what people are saying.
So Coco, can I ask a question? When
Yes.
You're talking about the public debate, you're talking about the council as a whole discussing items, correct?
No, in public debate, I'm talking about when the public is speaking at the mic during public comment.
Okay, so that's what I was kind of confused, because when you talk about debate, I
You're
take
thinking-
into consideration the back and forth, which does not happen with the public.
No, it does not have, and I actually am very much in favor of what was said. I do not think it's a good idea to answer the public's questions at all during public comment. I think that what you have is very interesting, and I have seen this in other communities where at the end of the meeting, during the time when the council members may speak, they also have the opportunity to respond to questions from the public. As I say, I've seen that other places, and I think that that's quite effective, because then you're not really entering into debate with the person who is at the microphone. And one of the issues that happens is, yes, it's okay to, as Chris suggested, answer a simple thing like, yes, the program starts on May 1st, but often that leads into a time when people begin to expect, well, you answered Fred, why don't you answer me about why we have to have this tax put on us? So, it's kind of like family. How much you let go depends on how much you're willing to pay for the fact that it was uneven. So I am very much in favor of thanking people for coming to the microphone and meaning it, and then having them sit down. Next slide. Tips for better meetings. Obviously, you've got start the meeting on time, and you've got number 2 down, very clear rules of procedure, direct all comments and questions through the chair, and discourage the addition of last-minute items not already on the agenda. That really upsets council members when they get seat materials, as they often call them. Okay, that's the end of that. We can go back to the screen so I can see everybody. Now is a good time for questions. Whoop. Let me get a view here where I can see everybody, so I can see your questions. We're going to go now to the motions. As I mentioned, the main motion, and this is on in your rules of procedure, you have this chart. And it's a really good one for, as we look at making a main motion. The steps are and be thinking about your meetings, and be thinking about, in your meetings, where do you get stuck? What part of the process is not working as well as you hope? A main motion is made. I move that, or I move to. It is seconded by someone. And I like to stress second. What's another common word that people use when after a motion is made?
Support.
So moved.
So moved. Oh, thank you. Hold on to so moved for just a moment.
Support.
Let's go to support, right? I don't like support. It's not wrong. But the fact is, it implies that I'm for the motion. I may not be for the motion. In fact, it might be something that I know I'm going to speak against and vote against, but it's an issue that's been hanging out there for so long. I want it to be brought up and taken care of. So that's why I like second. Second only means there's another person who wants to talk about it. Support implies that I'm going to vote for it, and I might not be. Then, and I'm going to come back to so moved, then the chair states the motion. That's really important. Not only, as I said, so we are clear, but that lets the maker know, did I just say it correctly? Did I misstate their motion? The maker can right then fix it. Also, before I state the motion, the maker can withdraw it. See, because it hasn't been given to the whole group yet. So before the motion is stated, I can withdraw it. And before the motion is stated, if I seconded it, I can change my mind and withdraw my second. The kind of the person, when you say the motion, when the chair says the motion, that says, okay, this is what's in front of us. Now it belongs to everybody, which is an important thought. Yes, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have your hand up?
Sorry, no, I was wiping something off of my screen.
That's perfectly all right. Usually it's because we're going to turn something. So move, second, chair states it, and then immediately turns to the maker and says, do you wish to speak to your motion? After that happens, then we open it to, and that's where the word debate is. We open it to debate and discussion for everyone, and everyone can have a turn. Some communities, the council members have adopted rules about how long they can speak on a motion, how long, who gets the next turn, how everybody has to have a turn to speak first, everybody speaks again. That is all the kinds of things that people have in their rules. And when you find a rule that says how long a person can speak during, and I'm talking about the elected officials now, not the public. The elected officials have put a time of how long they can speak, or any kinds of different kinds of rules. So that's allowable. Now we're having all kinds of debate and discussion. And this is where we have the thing called call for the orders of the day, which is a Robert's Rules way of saying, can we please get back to the motion on the floor? So if at any time you feel like the discussion has gotten too far away from where it should be, you can use the phrase call for the orders of the day, or you can simply, as we more likely say in our language, Madam Chair, Mayor, what is the topic? What are we discussing? Can we get back to the issue on hand? So it's always, I like it. Yes, Commissioner Law, Councilmember Lawyer.
Yes, I am wondering, is this the same as point of order?
No, it isn't. But
Okay.
a point of order is another way to get there. Point of order, we are no longer discussing the motion on the floor. This is call for the orders of the day. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Councilmember.
Can we say call the question?
You can say that, but remember that's the motion to close debate. And so if you say call the question, or question as it's sometimes abbreviated, I as the chair should say, this is the motion to close debate. Is there a second? Moved and seconded to close debate. And as you may know, this takes a 2/3 vote, because anytime we take away members' rights, it takes a 2/3 vote. That's just kind of one of those little factoids to tuck in the back of your head. If I'm going to do something that takes away people's rights, it's going to take a bigger vote. One place in your rules, you use the phrase 2/3 majority. That's like saying, could you please pass me an apple pear? They're both fruits, but they're different kinds. A 2/3 vote is 2/3. A majority is a majority. I point this out because I have an organization that is just having a big battle. Their bylaws refer to a 2/3 majority, and they want something to be adopted that's not very popular. So a portion of the group is going, well, it says majority. That just means majority. Forget about the 2/3. And the people who don't want it say, no, 2/3 means 2/3. So people say, well, that's really splitting hairs, Coco. How can you even think about discussing whether something should say a 2/3 majority? And I said, because it gets you into trouble sometimes if you're not clear about what it is you want to say. And by the way, it's clear to me that in your rules of procedure, it's really 2/3 that's needed on that particular vote. Yes, council member?
I'm curious, is 2/3 the equivalent of a super majority?
No, that is so interesting, because I did a workshop for the Michigan Association of Municipal Attorneys with the company that had the CD-ROM for Roberts. And I said to the fellow that I was going to do the workshop with in advance on the phone, I said, I'm going to ask you to use the CD-ROM ability to search the Robert's rules to find the word supermajority, and you're not going to be able to find it. And he said to me, oh, I think you're wrong. And I said, well, try it and call me back. So he called me back and he said, the word supermajority is not in the book. I said, no, it's an invention of the press.
Interesting. Okay.
And it sometimes is used for a 3/4 vote. Sometimes it's used when they're referring to a 5/6 vote. Sometimes it uses when the 2/3 vote. In other words, it is literally what the word says, a super more than majority. We're seeing quite a bit of, I must admit to not being terribly glued to the TV on the happenings in Washington right now. But my friends who are watching me telling me there's a lot of parliamentary procedure going on. And in fact, part of it is about a vote requirement. So it's really clear. So I stay away from the word supermajority and try to use what I actually mean. 2/3, 3/4. So but backing up for just a moment on the motion. So the council doesn't have anything on the floor. They're just having a discussion, and the chair says, well, does somebody wish to make a motion? And the chair says, and somebody says, so moved. And the clerk can very honestly say, who so moved what? And I see this a lot when there's somebody will just say so moved about something that's going on. And the chair should always say, would you please state the motion? So that's why I try to stay. Now, in a printed council agenda, if you have a motion that is there and a person says about it, so moved, the chair should pick up that and read the motion as stated in the agenda. Many councils use prepared motions, and so a resolution ordinance. I notice that your rules make a clear distinction between an ordinance, a resolution, and a motion. So depending on what you're making, if it's not stated by the person who's making the motion, the chair should read the motion into the record. So let's say we have our motion on the floor to buy, well, actually, I always have to confess that my favorite group to be the parliamentarian for is the Wayne State Student Senate. They are really very, very good. There are 24 of them, and they take turns wonderfully. There's a person who sits next to the president just keeping track of who's raised their hands. They use what looks like a ping pong paddle, but it has their title on it, and they hold that up when they're ready to speak, when they want to speak, and then they get a nod from the person next to the president, so they put their paddle down, and eventually they get called on, and they don't speak again until everyone's had a turn. It's really very orderly and very good. And so when we have our, about 5 years ago, maybe a little more now, the incoming president of the Student Senate said to me, do we have to have a retreat? And I said, no, except that that's where you usually set your goals for the year, and where I do the training on how to make motions, because you're about to make some motions about what you want to do. Oh, no, he said, I want to have the meeting. I just don't want to call it a retreat, because during my presidency, we're not going to go back. We're going to go forward. So I want to have a forward. So now every year they call their retreat a forward. Anyway, so during the retreat, we have to practice the motions, because they're about to make the motions about their projects for the year, and they're going to make a lot of amendments to it as they go through. So to practice making a motion and amending, and of course, there are always enough students who are repeating that they know this from history. The motion is always, I move we order a pizza, because you can do a lot to motion to order a pizza. And so moved and seconded, stated by the chair to order a pizza, and the maker of the motion speaks to it. And then the next person, of course, says, I move to insert pepperoni before pizza. And so then we have a whole discussion about pepperoni. Of course, the vegetarians in the room are going to vote no on the pepperoni, but the pepperoni will still be adopted so that the amended motion is I move we order a pepperoni pizza, and invariably somebody will say, I move to amend by inserting and a cheese pizza. So there are lots of amendments, and you can amend by striking out, by inserting, adding at the end, and invariably somebody will move to insert from Jets, and that'll get somebody move to strike out Jets and insert Little Caesars. And as you can see, you can do it. And then at the end, somebody will always say, because they've heard the debate in the past, I move to amend by adding, and Coco will pay for it, which always passes. The point simply is that's how amending works. You make an amendment, it gets a second, gets stated by the chair. The chair asks the maker of the amendment, do you wish to speak to your amendment? The amendment is then discussed, all those, and then we vote on the amendment. Some people who are not as skilled want to vote on the motion and then later vote on the amendment. But I want you to think of it as kids' blocks, and the main motion is the block that's on the bottom, and the amendments are put on top of it. And if you took the main motion out from the bottom, you would upset your cart. So all those in favor of the amendment to insert pepperoni, say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the motion as amended is before you to buy a pepperoni pizza. So you just keep adding on things until finally the motion is to order a pepperoni pizza and a cheese pizza from Hungry Howie's, and Coco will pay for it. That's the motion as amended all over the place. All those in favor of the amended motion say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, which they always do. And the nice thing is, for the clerk, you just have to put down the main motion as originally made. John Fitzgerald moved to order a pizza. The motion as adopted was, so you don't have to put in all those steps. The motion as adopted was to order a pepperoni pizza and a cheese pizza from Hungry Howie's, and Coco pays for it. Motion adopted. So that's amending, which is probably the most popular tool that happens in government. Do you lay things on the table very often? I don't see anybody saying yes.
So
You
does
do-
that mean, like, do you bring things up at council meeting that weren't on the agenda?
No, although I noticed that your rules are very clear about that. So I think that the rules are very clear at preventing something from coming up that nobody knows about. And then Chris calls it a gotcha, and that's a good rule. And it's the citizens who reflect the most that gotcha on that one. But I think your rules are very clear to prevent that from happening. And I think that that's very wise. The amending of the agenda is a different step from lay on the table. Somebody will say table, and they put it off to another meeting. Yes.
So yes,
Okay.
we do have those.
Yes.
Yes.
And I want you to, I'm not a fan of lay on the table, and I'll tell you why. It's not debatable. It's not amendable. And if we don't take it from the table by the end of the next meeting, it's gone. It has a nickname. It's called the killing motion, because in organizations where they don't keep track of motions laid on the table, since it falls from the table at the end of the next meeting, it's gone. And it's a way people had of getting rid of things that they didn't want to talk about. Lay on the table is meant for this purpose. We're discussing the motion on the benches, and in comes our state senator to bring us an update from Lansing. That's a perfect time for lay on the table. I move to lay on the table the motion on benches. It gets seconded. It's not discussed. The chair takes the vote. All those in favor of the motion to lay this on the table, say aye. Those opposed, say no. Please speak to us, Senator. Senator's finished. Somebody says, I move to take from the table the motion on benches. And it can be anybody who says that. It can even be somebody who wasn't in the room when the motion was laid on the table. It also is not debatable to take it from the table. So the whole thing is intended to be very, very quick. What is the motion to use? The motion to use, I will come right back to you, Councilmember Clark. The motion to use is postpone to a certain time. That's the motion to use because it's debatable. I can say, I move to postpone this to the next meeting. I move to refer this to Parks and Recreation Committee. In other words, I have a reason to put it off someplace else. That motion gets a second stated by the chair, and it is debatable and amendable. So I can say, the reason I moved to postpone this was I understand they're making benches out of shredded tires now, or all kinds of things. And that now is going to go to the committee. So that's why postpone to a certain time is so much better than lay on the table. Councilmember Clark, please.
So usually that's what, when it's being untabled, it's because lack of information that was brought. And that's why we usually say we move to table it because we need such and such information. So you're saying we should say postpone. So from that point, should the clerk automatically put it on the next agenda for us not to lose it?
Yes, or if it's referred to a committee, keep track of it. But yes, a good tracking system is really important. It's really important. But yes, if you would switch from the word table to postpone, you would be much more in line with what was intended by the motions.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, lay on the table is the only motion where Robert says the chair can ask you for what purpose do you make that motion? Because there was so much misuse of it that it's allowed. That's a good one. Are there other motions that you use frequently? Something that I get asked about very regularly is reconsider. People want to change their minds about what was done. Your rules do contain quite a good description of reconsider. The thing about reconsider is it's the only American-made motion. So it's more complicated than any of the others. It just has more parts that I wouldn't even tell you about. You never need to know that. As I often say, 85% of the questions I get come from only 15% of the book. Oh, and I should tell you, this is Robert's Rules of Order in brief. And it's available from your favorite bookstore or on the national website of the National Association of Parliamentarians. And it is really what you need to know. It's bigger print. It has an interesting section called Frequently Asked Questions. It's really Robert's Rules of Brief. I recommend this. Oh, do you have that? There you go. That's the book. That's the book to have. If you're going to be chair of something, I would not. I think everybody, probably every community seems to have somebody has a copy of Roberts. Sometimes it's the attorney, sometimes it's the city clerk. It's in somebody's office. And but what really is useful is this.
Ms. Coco, I also found this on Amazon when I was looking for it. It's like a quick study guide.
I have that one, but the print is so small.
Yeah. It seemed really convenient.
The one you have in the chart that you have in your rules, at the end of your rules, is a good one because you could actually cut out one of those and just have it next to you in the meeting. And it gives you a grid to allow you to see if it needs a second, if it's debatable, if it's amendable. It's a really good, somebody called it a cheat sheet, and it is that. It's a good one. So back for a moment to reconsider. Reconsider has two restrictions that are important and are mentioned in your rules. And that is, it can only be made on in the same meeting, and it must be made by somebody who voted on the prevailing side. So to give you this in a little scenario, the traffic consultant was not at the meeting, had not arrived at the meeting, but the issue on the agenda was the placement of a stop sign on Chesterfield. And it was presented and discussed by the council members and voted 6 to 1 to place the stop sign. Now I see the traffic engineer come in and he speaks to the police chief, and when there's nothing happening on the agenda, on the floor, he goes to the traffic engineer, goes to the microphone and says, "I'm sorry, Mayor, I got stuck in traffic and I'm late, but I wanted to report on the stop sign." So I invited him to do so, and he said, "You don't have the warrants to place that stop sign there." And he gave this whole report, basically saying, don't do that. So now there we were, still in the same meeting. So one of those 6 people who voted for the placement of the stop sign, which was the prevailing side, had to make the motion to reconsider. Why is that? Well, basically because if you don't have one person who'll change their mind, the outcome will always be the same. So Councilmember Fox moved to reconsider the vote on the motion to place the stop sign. Think of that as the toaster with the Pop-Tart. It's still in there, but it just comes back before you as if you had not voted on it. It's still, the motion is still on the floor. It's still all there. It's still intact, but it's as if you had not voted on it. That's an important thing to realize, because people who use this motion sometimes forget, just because you voted to reconsider does not mean you changed your mind. It only means you reconsidered the vote. It popped up before you. So we did that. He gave us the full report. And this time on the motion to place the stop sign, the vote was 1 to 6. Everybody changed their minds. Now, what if he had not come in that meeting? What if we were at the next meeting and now the report comes in that we shouldn't have done the stop sign? You can no longer reconsider, because according to the rule, it's only the same meeting, or the next day, but that's an allowance for conventions. But you could rescind, and you can rescind anything that has not been done. If you can undo it, you can rescind it. In this particular case, it was a stop sign. And as we're sitting here on this somewhat snowy, slippery morning, in your community and in mine, and probably in Chris's too, somebody is running over a stop sign. So if you had an extra stop sign that you ordered, just put it in the back of the DPW garage and you'll need it in a few days. In the case of something that has been done, then you have a problem with rescind, because it has to be something that has not been done. So if you signed the contract, and I use the example of a community in the UP, and I don't know the backstory, but they voted to pave a park and make it into a parking lot. And when the project started, the citizens went nuts, and they called, said, what do we do? And I asked them if the contract that they signed had a penalty clause, and it did. And so they were able to rescind and pay the penalty clause as required by the contract. But sometimes you can't undo something. Then often, so that's rescind and reconsider. Often I'll get the request, this motion failed at the last meeting. How do we reconsider? The answer is you don't. It failed. It failed. Simply make the motion over again and start over again. So if something is presented and no action is taken to make it positively, to make it happen, then you simply make the motion over again.
Coco, I think we had a couple of questions out here about this topic.
Super. I'll start up in what is for me that corner, which is Councilmember Lawler.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Coco. So if there was if it passed to have this stop sign put up, 7 people, 4 people voted yes, 3 voted no, but maybe a fourth, one of the 4 that said yes thought about it and wanted to change their mind. How do we do that?
Say if you're in the same meeting, you say, I move to reconsider the vote on the stop sign.
So what if we are not, and a couple days went by and we like, well, I changed my mind. I wonder, can I bring it back to the table?
Right. Then at the next meeting, first of all, you'd have to put it on the agenda. So if you have I noticed that you have a time in your rules where you discuss things to put on the agenda. Yeah, then you could say, I'd like to put this on the agenda for the next meeting. At the next meeting, you would say, I'd like to put it on the next agenda. So you could bring it back that way. If you are in the same meeting and you want to change your vote, which is a different thing, you personally, individually, you're not asking the council to change its mind about an action, but you personally have decided that you want to change your vote, you need unanimous consent for that. I got this question again this week, which always surprises me. It only comes a few times a year, and that is somebody who believed that if before the minutes were approved, they could change their vote. Those are 2 things that are entirely different. The approval of the minutes says, yes, I was there, this is what happened. But the actions taken that are reported in the minutes can't be changed by changing the minutes. The minutes are what you did. So, but that would be who else had a question?
I have one.
Yes.
So if during the meeting, you've reconsidered something and it's been changed and you voted, but like you said, it's still in the same meeting, that is when you can speak up and say, I want to reconsider my vote. And then what do we do after that happens?
You say, I move to reconsider the vote on the benches.
Okay.
And that requires a second.
Okay.
And then the chair will state it and ask you to speak to it. And that's when you can say why you want to reconsider it.
Okay.
But that's reconsidering the vote of council.
Right.
As opposed to merely saying, I changed my mind. May I have permission to change my vote on such and such? That's an individual request to change just my vote. And the fact that it gets unanimous vote, requires a unanimous vote, you can see that depending on how the vote was. I mean, if the vote was 6-1 and you were the one and thought, gee, it would be really nice if the record reflected that I was in favor of this too, with the other 6, then they're likely to let you change it. But if the vote was a split vote and what you were asking to change would change the outcome, you're not likely to get permission to change your vote.
So what do you do in the case that if there's a vote and you get, no, it's not a vote. You're getting ready to vote and you're really on the fence and don't think that you have enough information to make that vote?
And that motion is on the floor.
Yes.
And you're saying to yourself, go ahead and postpone.
Okay.
Go ahead and postpone, or refer to a committee, or refer back to the administration, to wherever you think that information is. The votes on the floor by the benches, I'd really like the input of the Parks and Rec Board on what we should do on this. I move to refer this to the Parks and Rec Board for a report at the next meeting. And always, when you make the motion to postpone, always put in it when you want the report back.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
Coco, in that situation, so let's say the motion was already on the floor, it was already seconded, so there's a vote needed. So let's say one council person makes that motion to postpone, but everybody else feels we have enough votes to proceed.
And the motion to postpone requires a second and a majority vote. All those in favor of postponing this say aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it, and the motion to buy the benches will not be postponed. Is there further discussion?
But then there still has to be a vote on the original motion, correct?
Oh, yes, yes. Which is why when we had that one slide, I said I emphasized the fact that there can only be one main motion on the floor at a time. But you may have any other helping motions called subsidiary or privileged or incidental. You know, I know people think parliamentarians are probably a really raucous, happy, fun-loving group. What we like to do for fun is start with a main motion and put all the motions allowable on the floor, one on top of the other, until we have all 13 motions on the floor, and then take them all back off again. So it is possible to have, when you're with parliamentarians, they really go wild, and you could have 3 or 4 motions on the floor at the same time, but they'll only be supported and about one main motion. That's kind of what would you say, the trunk of the tree from which the other motions branch out. Did you have another question, Council Member Lawler?
No, Ms. Mayor, she already addressed it. Yep.
Did our Assistant City Attorney have a question? I know he had his hand raised way back, but I don't know if he had his opportunity to ask, if he still had it.
No, I apologize. I accidentally clicked that and I realized about 2 minutes in that my hand was raised. So I went ahead and took it off.
Do
Okay.
you have any questions?
I do not. Thank you, though.
That's all right. For many years, I was the parliamentarian and scribe for the Wayne State Law Faculty. And that always surprises people, but as the attorney would know, we don't teach parliamentary procedure in law school. So that very often the calls that I get come from city attorneys who call to ask about a particular issue. Because it's assumed that they will know, and they often don't. Many of the clerks in Michigan, I shouldn't say many, a number of the city clerks in Michigan have become very skilled in parliamentary procedure and perform that role for their council when it comes to just plain parliamentary procedure. Because I'm always careful to say, as Chris gave his, I'm not your city attorney law rule in as he began, and I always say to groups, and I am not an attorney. I'm not an attorney, I'm a parliamentarian.
With that being said, I will say you can probably anticipate an email coming from me down the line as far as the procedure with parliamentary law. So
Yes, and actually I get them frequently, and I like emails because then I can write it out. When you explain parliamentary procedure to somebody who doesn't understand it, their interpretation of what you just said is not nearly what you would hope. Are there further questions? Are there any other motions that you use regularly? I do think that in nonprofits, I applaud the use of the term, if they're on the minutes. Are there any corrections? Seeing none, the minutes are approved as presented. We call that an assumed motion. It's when something is happening and you know that's just an assumed that you can go ahead and state that. Another popular assumed motion is if there is no further business, the meeting is adjourned. I recommend for elected and appointed bodies that you actually have a vote on the minutes and actually have a vote to adjourn. I think that it's because of the importance of the record of the minutes as a public record of a public meeting, and Also, because I had a number of situations where everybody wasn't really ready for the council meeting to be over, but the mayor gavelled it closed with the meeting's adjourned. And I think that both of those are bad practice. So because of the Open Meetings Act, we can't say, wait a minute, I didn't mean to adjourn that meeting. We have to say, is there a motion to adjourn?
We actually do vote on both of those items.
Excellent, excellent. Anything else? I think if I've covered all of your regular motions, that pretty much would be what we have to say today. Yes, council member.
Okay, you had mentioned something about having the final say. So can you or Mr. Chris kind of collaborate and let us know when our manager has the final say, when the council has a final say, and how we can work together to get it together?
I think those are good questions, and they're not uncommon questions to determine who has what role. And I think that the council should look to their charter, which has a pretty clear description of who does what. Chris, your thoughts?
Yes, I agree. When I was reviewing the charter, it placed certain activities in the council's purview and certain activities in the administration's purview. And I think that becomes your main guide. Obviously, if the city manager, I got to make stuff up just to show the how it's done, but let's say, the council really wanted to fix the roads and decided to put a lot of money into the budget for fixing roads. Even if the manager and the DPW were not in agreement, if that was the direction of the majority of the council, then that's something that the council has final authority over rather than the manager. So, sometimes you have to look at who had what responsibility, and passing the budget obviously is a council responsibility.
And I think that is an important point, that the people don't accept the fact as much that the budget is really a strategic planning tool. The budget is a very, very important tool in saying what you actually are going to do. And I think it doesn't get, whether it's from the public standpoint or the council standpoint or anyone's standpoint, doesn't always see the importance of putting your dollars where you really want the action to take place. So yes, your charter and your rules of procedure would help you determine who has what responsibility. And that's, by the way, that's important because this question comes up a lot. Councilmember Lawler?
I was just saying thank you.
You're welcome. Any other thoughts? Well, thank you for your patience. We'll look forward to your emails asking us. I get them often that says, what was it you said about reconsider? I laughed because it wasn't too long ago that I actually had a email from a fellow in Georgia who was a former mayor in one of the cities in Michigan, who was now president of his homeowners, and said he found me on his Rolodex, which I loved because I don't hear anybody say they have a Rolodex anymore, and sent me an email question for his homeowners group. So put me in your Rolodex. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you both, Coco and Chris. We appreciate the information that you shared with us. It is helpful for us as a council, as we move forward and hold meetings that will move our community forward.
Yes, and I would just feed off of what Mayor Snyder said. Thank you again for joining us this morning and providing all of the information. It is greatly appreciated.
Same. Thank you.
And
Thank you, And Ms. Whitfield, thank you for your technical assistance.
You're welcome. And the content materials that she was referring to, I put in the chat, but if anyone was interested, I have that available for the Roberts rules. But thank you everyone for your participation.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Yes, happy Valentine's Day.
Mayor, I think we'll turn it over to you to close out this study session.
Yeah, and Jesse, do we have anybody that's on that would like to be available for public comments?
I'm not seeing any. Let me just double check. No, none at this time.
All right. City Manager Snyder, do you have anything that you were going to share with us this morning?
No, I don't. I just want to thank you all for joining us this morning, and I look forward to seeing you Tuesday at our regular council meeting.
Awesome. Council members, anybody want to add any comments? I can't see everybody. Just
Looks
because.
like Councilmember Lawler has her hand up.
Okay. Councilmember Lawler.
Just wanted to let the council know my birthday is Tuesday. If you want to buy me something, I am available. I will be 51.
I am available for gifts.
Happy early birthday to you.
Send us your Cash App. Happy early birthday.
Any other council comments? All right, awesome. Do I have a motion to close our meeting today?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Coco, I know you said not to second, but.
Second is right.
Yeah, it was the other one she said not to.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to play that in my
Yes.
mind. Awesome. All right, so City Clerk Domingo, can you take roll call, please?
Councilmember Clark,
Yes.
Reed. Yes. Am I still?
You're good. Now you're on mute. Councilwoman Reed, you're still on mute.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Jackson. Councilmember Jackson,
Yes.
Lawler,
Yes.
Lanu,
Yes.
and Mayor Snyder.
Yes, and one thing before we do formally adjourn, I know that there was a public comment about how the session did not start recording right away. So Chris, if we can get your presentation to add to this YouTube session, we can get it added so that anybody who had joined from the beginning, but maybe didn't get to see that formal presentation, we can get it included too.
We actually have a copy of his, so we will upload that onto our website to make that available. My apologies for not recording that from the beginning.
That's okay. As long as we were able to catch it and then make an adjustment. Appreciate it. All right, all enjoy the rest of your weekend. I appreciate you all taking time to be here with these great folks to learn. And so, like City Manager Snyder said, we'll see you all on Tuesday night.
Yes.
I know.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
You too.